Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If we can find our seats, we're about to start shortly. All right, with that said, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Financial Mail Green Economy Conference. My name is Nastasia Arendse, and I will be your host for today. So we don't just have a live audience consisting of people who are in the room. We're also running a hybrid session, so a very big warm welcome to those of you who are watching us online. So this morning promises to bring rigorous and, of course, exciting conversation, and it wouldn't be possible without Schneider Electric in partnership with Mulilo, Siemens Energy Southern Africa, Sanlam Investments, Kyocera, the Energy and Water Sector Education Training Authority, and Lesedi. And I can tell you that we definitely have the right people in this room who are going to be part of this very important conversation about how we can foster a greener tomorrow. Our program will begin with a panel discussion. And this panel discussion is titled Towards a Greener Tomorrow, that is, Pioneering the Green Economy. And that panel discussion will be moderated by Zinati Kuma. And in this panel discussion, we'll discover how businesses and investors can align profitability with environmental responsibility. And we'll also learn from the successes of companies that have embraced eco-consciousness. Then we're going to take a comfort break. And then when we come back, we'll have a panel that I will be moderating, and then we'll wrap up the proceedings. Just some housekeeping rules. For many of you who have just walked in late, you will find the restrooms outside as you approach the registration desk, so they should be on your right. We also do have Wi-Fi, and we want to encourage you to post and take pictures. If there's any comments or anything that does stick out to you and you want to be able to post about it, please feel free to do so. You can use the hashtag #FMGreenEconomy. And because we are live streaming this event, I'd like to also ask that you check that your phones are either on silent or off. We want to have as little disturbances as possible, especially during those panel discussions. And as I mentioned, social media, absolutely indispensable for many of us. So that hashtag again is #FMGreenEconomy. For those of you who are watching online, we do have a Q&A that will be available. So basically at the end of each panel, we're going to open the session to taking audience questions, not just from people in the room, but also those of you who are watching online. So there is a Q&A facility for you to type out your questions. And for the guests who are in the room with me this morning, we do have roving mics, and we'll be able to take your questions. And however, during those panel discussions, Zinati and I will also be getting some of the questions coming through. So we'll be able to get questions from both in the room and, of course, online. Without much further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Zinati Kuma, and she is going to be basically handling her panel, and I'll also give her the opportunity to introduce her panelists.
Good morning, everybody. I feel like such a fraud with us going green, and I have all these papers with me. Let me put them down. Thank you very much, Nastasia. My name is Zinati Kuma, and my panel today is titled Towards a Greener Tomorrow, Pioneering the Green Economy. Now, the purpose of this panel is to get insights from companies that are leading the way in the green economy transition. Of course, the learnings that we get today are very important because in South Africa, this is still quite new territory. To some, it seems like a pie in the sky, but to others, it is critical, especially as we face energy and water insecurity and also climate change disasters. So let's meet our panelists that are planting this green grass. If you can please make your way to the stage as I call your name. So we have Devon Pillay, the cluster president for the Anglophone Africa region at Schneider Electric. And then Robin Vilagazi, the Chief Financial Officer at the Energy and Water Sector Education and Training Authority, that is the Energy and Water SETA. And we're also joined by Fergus Slattery, who is a director at CF Africa. And last but not least, Tebuo Makabane, who is the head of ESG and impact at Sanlam Investments. I think maybe let's go.
Maybe Jack me here.
Yes. Yes, please. All right, so as we start off the conversation, I'd like to get a brief introduction from each of the panelists on what each company does and how it fits into the green economy ecosystem. Of course, this is also for the benefit of the audience, as there will be a question and answer session after this 45-minute panel discussion, so that you know who to direct your questions to, specifically on the panel. So just a quick, easy elevator pitch. Devin, let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks again for the opportunity. So I'm Devin Pillay. I lead Schneider Electric in Anglophone Africa, based out of Johannesburg, but look after the English-speaking countries, which is dotted, 24 countries dotted around the sub-Saharan Africa part of the continent, with offices in Johannesburg, offices in Nairobi, Kenya, and offices, of course, in Lagos, Nigeria. So Schneider Electric, I had an interesting conversation with some of my colleagues earlier. The name sometimes resonates, sometimes does not resonate, because it's a brand that oftentimes is not in the public space. You don't get to see it like a consumer brand. Somebody asked me, does Schindler have any relationship this morning? And I said to her that our corporate video starts off by saying, we're not a lift company. So who are we, right? So we are energy management and automation company. So oftentimes our products and solutions are behind the building, in a cellar, at the basement, working, the automation and the brains behind a process. So the lift example again, the fact that when you press 1 and it goes to the first floor, that's us in the background, arranging that the automation and the mechanics of the lift are all working in harmony to get you to the right floor. And that application finds use in different parts of everyday life, whether it's transportation, it's buildings, it's data centers, it's power generation, and the consumption of power. So what I'd like to say from an elevator point of view, Schneider Electric, energy management automation company, what do we do around sustainability, and why am I here today on this topic of green economy? So on the basis of this digital solutions, we believe that everybody has a right to access to electricity and access to digital. And with that solution, we are able to mold all of these components together and offer this concept of sustainability. We know that electrification is the best vector for decarbonization, right? It may sound a bit weird, because when you think about electricity generation in our context, it's coming from coal belching power plants, right? But we're talking here about renewable energy. It's coming from green renewable sources. But then to use that energy in a manner that is effective, efficient, to allow the economic, the economies to grow, to give people access to this, because we know that once you have electrification, you have economic emancipation. So this is where Schneider Electric plays. Finally, we are, through this evolution as a company, whilst we drive our own agenda insofar as the circular economy is concerned, we also partner with companies to ensure that they also reach their own climate change goals and ambitions, right? So much so that for 12 years consecutively, we are one of the top 100 most sustainable companies in the world, and that's voted by Corporate Knights, which is a global organization. So I'll conclude there and hand over to my colleague.
All right. Let's get your introduction, Robin.
Thank you, ma'am. My name is Robin Vilagazi. I'm the CFO at EW SETA. EWSETA stands for the Energy and Water Sector Education and Training Authority. So we're a public entity, one of 21 SETAs that operates under the Department of Higher Education and Training. And what we're responsible for is for the energy and water sector, planning, ensuring that they've got the skills that they need to sustain but also thrive currently and for the future as well. So what that involves is, first of all, we do a lot of research, and we also synthesize a lot of industry and external research to understand the skills demand for the energy and water sectors. We use that research to develop qualifications. So we run a qualification authority. We use industry expertise to develop qualifications. We accredit those. We accredit institutions to provide those qualifications. We certificate learners, etc., against those qualifications. And then we also coordinate and facilitate skills development interventions at a national level to ensure that this energy and water sectors have the skills that they need. And we're driven really around the idea of inclusive economic participation, just ensuring that as a country, as we, face our challenges in the energy and water sector, that whatever it is, the changes that happen in those environments from a skills perspective, that South Africa has the capacity to be able to support those sectors to survive, and not just survive, but also to thrive.
All right, thank you for that. Quickly, I will come back to you, Deborah. Fergus, I just want to get your elevator pitch.
Cool. Morning, everybody. Morning, Zanati. Thanks very much. So I'm from CF Africa. CF Africa is an e-waste recycler. And when you think about the green economy, I mean, we really are a very small part of the pie. There's sustainable development, there's social inclusivity, there's efficiency and resources. And we are really at the end of that in terms of reverse logistics and getting things back and finding value out of commodities that are about to go to landfill. So it's keeping commodities out of landfill and finding value therein. We're wearing our Kyocera hat today as we were given the task of ensuring most of their products don't end up in landfill. So they have a goal of zero waste to landfill, and we're on a journey with Kyocera to ensure that happens.
All right. Deborah, I do also want to start off the question session with you. So if we can just get a quick elevator pitch from you, then I'll start off the questions.
Sure. I'm Deborah. I'm from Sanlam Investments. So we have Sanlam, the insurer, which my colleague will be on the panel speaking on that, the corporate, but I sit on the investment side. So on the investment side, we manage money from third-party institutional investors, pension funds, as well as Sanlam's money. So how we fit into the green economy, we invest in businesses and projects in the green space, but as well as investors in businesses. We use our power as shareholders to try drive green initiatives and activities and better disclosure in that space.
The rise of the activist investor. All right, well, let's actually start off the conversation. I mean, just looking at the South African company landscape right now, is linking company profits to the health of the environment a priority or not? And a lot of you would actually argue that it is, but should it be?
Yeah, it should be. And as I mentioned, investors are the biggest people with influence because we invest with shareholders. But companies have so many stakeholders, your customers, your staff, people around. We also have NGO and a lot of activist groups. So there's so many stakeholders who care, and we are moving green. Right now companies have to consider the impacts of load shedding in South Africa, water. It's from a risk perspective, they don't have a choice. To have a sustainable company, you have to, and as an investor as well, it will affect the bottom line. You want to see, are they provisioning for these risks? Are they aware of specific risks in their companies, in the industry they operate in? Some may do it as a tick box, but for it to be sustainable, I think you do find businesses who buy into the whole idea, subscribe to it, and embed it very well into their strategy and the move.
Robin, I actually want to come to you. I mean, for South African businesses to fully thrive, the economy needs to be growing. But we know that it's not growing because of a lot of structural issues. Deborah mentioned load shedding as well. And of course, you do need 5% growth to actually even make a significant dent in unemployment. So where does the green transition fit when there's a lot to consider in terms of all these other issues that are causing bottlenecks in the economy?
Yeah. Look, from our perspective, we've shifted a little bit from seeing the green transition as a potential inhibitor of the economic growth that we are seeking. Like Teboho mentioned, green is becoming imperative just from a survival perspective against the context of something as simple as load shedding. And we haven't even necessarily gotten into the space of being as panicked about our water crisis as we are about our energy crisis, because that one affects us on a day-to-day basis, right? From that perspective, green is becoming a business imperative just for survival. But we've also started seeing shifts in how we think about the potential that the green transition and the green economy has to actually build and grow our economy. In our space, one of the biggest discussions, and I know in a lot of spaces it's at the discussion stage now, but it's something that we're planning for, is, for example, the hydrogen economy, given the potential that it has to position South Africa globally and to create an economy where currently there is nothing. So there are areas like that that are potential for growth if we leverage them. And so it's not for me just about, I think sometimes the common discussion is the green transition, like it's a trade-off between profitability and efficiency versus looking at this green thing, which is sometimes seen as like an environmental issue, but it's actually becoming a business imperative, and it has major potential to create economic growth in spaces that don't currently even exist.
Yeah, that's the thing, because it is seen as an either-or, because as I mentioned, there are more pressing issues that people feel like we should be concentrating on this rather than this new thing. So is it a case of we need to build the plane while flying it?
Yes. I think in a lot of cases that is it. I'm fairly young. So I'm fairly young. So I don't have the history of I don't have that much of a lived experience. But for as long as I've been in the working world, I've been building the plane while flying it. That's what I see around me. To me, that's not something that's new or different. The world is characterized by a pace of change that commands that you build the plane as you fly it. And I think as a government institution, sometimes if I look at the private sector versus the public sector, I sometimes look at us in the public sector and how we get that wrong. We're not necessarily willing to build the plane while it's flying. We kind of want to put the perfect plan and strategy in place. And in the process of doing that, we miss the immediate the immediate actions, the quick wins, the no regret bets. So, and that's something that us as government perhaps need to get better at, because I think that's the world we live in, and I don't think, for me, that's not a new thing or it's not a change. It's always been the way it is.
Yeah, actually quite an interesting point that you make there, that a lot of companies feel like you need to put in the perfect plan and strategy in place in order for you to start in this green transition effort. And I actually want to come to you, Devin. I mean, where do companies start in terms of adopting cleaner operating practices in an environment that is still heavily dependent on fossil fuels?
Yeah. No, look, I think ultimately it starts with a plan, right? It starts with bold ambitions. And, it's when you're operating in an environment that is as under pressure as we are today, as a planet, where we've got an existential threat of complete demise, right? And that's the reality. No company profit, no company strategy can be done in isolation of this reality, on the one hand, right? So that's, I know it may sound like a moral or a philosophical conversation to have, and you talk to the financial guys about, how does it contribute to your bottom line and P&L? It makes it a different conversation. When you look at the components, and we talked about circular economy, we talked about efficiencies and so on. And if you just dial back a bit and just think about your current environment with the situations of load shedding at the moment, right? And your consciousness as a consumer about your consumption behavior, that in itself is exactly what we are suggesting to companies where to start, right? So you start with a bold plan, and oftentimes, as you said, it should not be an either or. It should be, it's part of an integrated plan. Because ultimately, when you look at your bottom line and you look at all the cost processes or the cost of processes, and if you look at optimization, as you are today as consumers, looking at, okay, I've got this energy crisis, I need to have reliable power, but I'm now conscious of when I switch on my dishwasher, or when I switch on my high consumption load appliances in your household. Similarly, in a manufacturing operation, that needs to happen as well. That consciousness needs to happen. Now, it can't happen to the scale at which you are doing it as a private consumer, because you're talking about a large-scale industrial facility or a multi-site facility, as in the form of a mining operation. And this is where we come in as one of many companies that have solutions to digitize all of this information, to make it available to you. And this is why we say electrification and digitization need to go hand in glove, because one without the other is difficult to navigate, So with this digital revolution, we call it, this industrial revolution, or industrial 4.0, and then subsequently electricity 4.0. Because this is kind of the new energy landscape we're talking about right now, insofar as starting this agenda of conservation. Now, I'm talking electricity, but it doesn't start there, and it doesn't stop there, rather. It goes on to different parts of the process. And remember, when you look at sustainability as well, other than the aspect of environment, there's a whole host of other aspects associated with socioeconomic elements. Things that are, pressing matters for us insofar as skills development, unemployment, diversity, corporate governance. All of those matters, or all of those, metrics, all contribute to having this kind of sustainable business framework. And we all understand the benefits of that. Good corporate governance, in the past was, okay, we've got to run our business and then have good corporate governance. Today, it's an integrated part of who you are as a company. It is your brand. And similarly, that's the way we should see sustainability and the greening of our businesses, in that it is an integrated part. And I'll conclude by saying this. It won't be long. And we cannot operate as a microcosm, right? In the sense that when you look at the South African market, it is far too small to give you scale as a manufacturing operation. So you have to consider that your market is beyond our borders. And what does that mean? The consumer beyond our border is becoming a lot more discerning with respect to where they source and what type of product they're sourcing from their suppliers, right? And they're imposing huge restrictions right now, carbon taxes, cross-border taxes. So that's going to drive an imperative where if you're unable to satisfy this demand from a customer point, you're going to be irrelevant. And the woes that you talked about with respect to our manufacturing sector, which is declining in competitiveness because of all the issues that we're dealing with in the country, is going to get worse. And today, the manufacturing sector, which is a travesty in itself as to where we've come from early 80s, 90s, and subsequently now, all those factors of production that were so beneficial and so competitive to South Africa in the form of, cheaper electricity, fantastic infrastructure, rail infrastructure, skills capability, the availability of cheap labor and skills. All of those things right now are under threat. Then you add on that this uncompetitiveness with respect to your greening of your economy, and you've got a double whammy effect.
Yeah.
So it's really, something that you cannot separate. It has to be an integrated plan.
Before I come to you, Fergus, just your point on the manufacturing industry, we have all these headwinds pointing to some kind of need for evolution in that manufacturing sector. There's loss of competitiveness. Its contribution to the South African economy has actually shrunk over the past 16 years. And you talk about the fact that, the sustainable electrification and digitization have to go hand in hand. But I would imagine that for a legacy sector like manufacturing, those would seem like quite intimidating parts. And I wonder how adaptive manufacturers then are to that.
And that's a great question. You're right. Sometimes when you look at the cost of greening your economy, just take renewable energy as an example, right? And we know the fact that we've been plagued by this energy resilience or energy security aspects in our country for a long time, right? But when you look at the cost of renewable, whether it's hydrogen or whether and green hydrogen per se, or particularly green hydrogen, when you look at renewables in the form of wind or solar, these come at significant costs. I mean, as a private consumer, it's costly. Never mind a big industrial application or a large infrastructure as a mine. So this immediately becomes a prohibitive cost. However, what we find through the evolution of technology and a multi-participative structure where we've got multiple companies coming up with new ideas. Now, as Schneider and many of our peer companies and competitors are plowing in as much of our revenues into R&D. So, we plow in about 5 to 6% of our revenues into R&D, primarily to bring costs within the range that is acceptable and palatable to these companies wishing to drive this green revolution, right? Because we believe right now that if we stand on a pedestal and preach about the fact that we need to be more sustainable, but don't enable this sustainability drive through innovation, through cost-effective innovation, it's going to be just, again, an ambition and a dream. So that's the first part, is that you'll see time and time again. Again, I'll bring it down to the consumer. When you look at your solar panels 10 years ago and your inverters 10 years ago, completely unaffordable. Today, because of competition, because of technology, and because of the rampant progress with respect to technology, you find that it becomes affordable. And you've got a wide range to start somebody off, with a small kilowatt inverter, and they've got capacity to add on and build on and so on. And that's really where we're advocating as well for companies to start small, right, and to start making this progressive change. So, it does not become where you start to take it and it redlines your P&L from the get-go, but you start making progressive investments towards it, and that is appreciated by your customer. And oftentimes, the challenge is, are customers willing to pay for green products, right? And as you as a consumer, are you willing to buy that toothbrush that you can throw into a biodegradable dump at some point, right? And that's the question we always ask ourselves. And more customers are, and this is becoming a requirement of us. Circular economy, for example, we produce circuit breakers. These are large, bulky, pieces of plastic and metal and PVC, and oftentimes we wonder, okay, once this is end of life, it naturally ends up in dump sites, etc. But now there's a massive drive to make and design products that can be reused. We can extend life. We can harness and harvest components out of it for reuse. And that's driving the R&D part of it as well in terms of product design and manufacture.
Well, glad you make that point. You guys are just doing all the work for me here. The conversation is flowing nicely. And now coming to you, Fergus. We're just talking about, where do companies start? But let's jump to the end, or what's supposed to be the end of a product. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the end, right? So what do manufacturers need to consider so that the life cycle of a product is continuous and environmentally friendly?
Yeah, great question. And I think Devin hit on the R&D. So effectively, that's a cradle-to-grave solution that you're looking at there. And it starts off with the commodities that you use for your product. What commodities, what resources are you using that can be used again? Look at plastics, for example. There's 7 different types of plastics. 3 of them have to go to landfill, the rest can be traded. Why aren't we using the plastics that can be reused, for example? So, it's the resources that you're using. The production cycle, obviously the sustainable practices within production cycles. And then there's distribution, on this cradle-to-grave solution. Quite interestingly, the e-commerce, they thought there'd be a lot less distribution. But a funny story is that what you buy online, you're 2 to 3 times more likely to send back than buying in a store, which brings back the whole reverse logistics, increased carbon footprint, and so on and so forth. And then obviously you've got the use of the product. Are we not extending the life of products? From the printer point of view, Contracts used to be 3 to 5 years. Now they're extended to 8 years, so we use less resources, for example. I know Kyocera had a program where their parts lasted a lot longer. And then, of course, you've got the grave. What happens to it once it's finished and it's done? You know, how do we extract the value out of those products? And from an e-waste point of view, there's actually quite a bit of value there. So it can be done. It's a great job creator, and yeah, that's how it really works.
All right. Well, we've spoken about the need for environmentally friendly business practices, and I want to talk about the social impact of going green. Of course, just this week, on the sidelines of the BRICS Summit, Standard Bank CEO Sim Chabalala urged for a fair and equitable climate transition. And that means not being forced to abandon the fossil fuels that we have an abundance of in Africa while doing that. And of course, earlier on, I spoke about how we should be maybe building the plane while flying it. And Robin, I want to come to you. Can there be a clash or a compromise between the priorities within ESG, particularly with an economy such as South Africa, where employment or unemployment has been standing pat at record levels?
Ish. The reality is that there is. And I think especially in South Africa, given our country's history, the clash that I see a lot of the time is between all of the other business elements and the elements of ESG and the social. One example that we see, for example, we work closely with because of our water focus, there's a lot of overlap with the agricultural industry, and so the sustainable practices that you adopt in the agricultural industry, often you see that they have an impact on the social aspect in terms of just, employment in that community or whatever the case might be. So, yes, we do see that, and that's why you see the advocacy for what we call it the just transition, to ensure that it harms as few people as possible. We do see those clashes, but we also need to look at it perhaps from the perspective of, look, none of these changes are happening overnight, and there is actually time to transition. We can't hold the transition back for fear of the harm that it might cause. We have to be mindful and measured in the approach that we take. But the way that I think about it is, if you, if you were a coal mine, should you be increasing your headcount of miners a lot right now? No, you shouldn't. But it's likely that there are going to be, most people that have those jobs at the moment could probably stay in them until the point at which they were going to retire in any case, because the process of transition is a multi-year and multi-decade process. So that's kind of the way that we think about it. But yes, there are those elements, and one actually has to be so mindful and considered and broad in the approach when you think about those issues, all of those elements. They're always going to be in conflict, I think.
Deborah, I want to come to you. What's your approach to financing when a company or a project does not satisfy all the requirements in that ESG complex? I mean, can you forgive instances where it makes sense to not move as fast in the green transition to guard against the loss of jobs?
It depends. If we are investing for the purposes of being green, like it's in one of our green mandates, we're very strict that it ticks the boxes. I think we have frameworks that help us think through that. We have the South African Green Finance Taxonomy that the National Treasury launched last year, which is helpful. It gives you activities and a way of checking, what are the activities the company is doing, how much of their revenue goes into that. So in that bucket, we strict. But in general, investing, it depends where the company's at. So what we want to see is, do you have a plan? If a company doesn't have a plan and the next time you engage with them, they now disclose perhaps their scope 1, 2 emissions and the water usage, that's progress. And for the next company, they were already disclosing, but you can see is there improvement over time. And also you want a clear transition plan for a company that is well thought through, you have a sense of materiality in your space, how would it affect you? And obviously, I mean, some companies are trying to comply, and you can also see potential risks of greenwashing because, I mean, you can do it in the short term, but in the long term, it's not sustainable.
Yeah. Devin, earlier on, we were talking about the shrinking of the manufacturing industry, and of course, that affects employment. That's also been on a downtrend. That sector has been shedding jobs even before COVID-19. So how does the green transition take into account sustainable employment in the industry amid this trend of a slowdown?
Yeah, look, it is a concern. And, when we even talk about the Industrial Revolution, there's this notion that it aims to displace your traditional job. And then you overlay on that this green, ambition and drive and revolution. And you've got, again, another opportunity to displace people that have been traditionally in roles that may have been literally unskilled or semi-skilled roles. Whereas this kind of new era calls for a lot more skilling. But, I take heart in looking, again, at very everyday scenarios, right? So you look at, for example, I bring it back to the consumer, I bring it back to this age that we are in right now, or the period we are in right now, insofar as finding alternative energy sources in our homes. And today, and I'm not sure if the audience has a similar experience, to try and get an electrician today to come over to do some kind of electrical work on your home is quite a task, right? Because you find that most of the electricians, and those that are not even certified electricians, that have a vague understanding of connecting electrical cables and apparatus together, are fully employed in the renewables space today, right? So installing solar panels, installing inverters, and so on. And when you look at our institutions, the TVET colleges, if you look at the technicons, the universities, etc., it's been slow. It's been slow to transform, to empower this workforce to be employable, to be productive in facing the current challenges and taking advantage of this window of opportunity. So what have these gentlemen and women have done is that they've gone online. They've gone online, and that's the revolution as well that has brought a new dynamic to training and development and upskilling. They've gone online and they've done after-hours courses, and we do a lot of that as well, in terms of our own Schneider Electric Academy. But people are coming online, learning, and going out into the marketplace without the necessary, huge certifications and so on, because that's not required right now. It's what's required is the confidence to be able to get out into the marketplace, to market yourself and so on. I'll give you another example. We used to have personas within Schneider Electric as customer personas that we had, very good database information on who these people are, how to serve them, how to, reach them, and what type of product to supply them. That customer persona today has fundamentally changed because it is your non-electrician that has not gone through the traditional institutions, right, and got the certification and is registered with the Electrical Contractors Association, which is where we used to extract, of course, the database from. It's your person, we call them the Bucky Brigade. It's your person that is able to work through, family businesses, amass some experience, and has become an entrepreneur, and has been able to, be actively engaged in the economy. So I firmly believe right now, using that as an example, it's not a dead end, right? And there's this constant reskilling that needs to happen. Now, of course, government, it's a multi-pronged approach again. It needs a lot of participation, and private sector plays a huge role there as well. And again, I know many of our peer companies and competitors, and ourselves included, we have a huge apprenticeship program. We're bringing in skills. We're bringing in graduates. We're bringing in, learnerships, just so that we can start to encourage people to grow. And then insofar as disruptive learning is concerned, on job, we find today that, again, in the engineering space, we had very disciplined streams. Even in university or technicon or wherever, you had disciplined streams. Today we find that it is, there's a blending of skills that are happening, where you had a mechanical engineer previously, and it was like the holy grail that this person would never touch something that was electronic or electrical. It's not the case today, right? And you find a new curriculum coming out in the form of mechatronics, which kind of bridges this world of mechanical and electronics, because, as I said, you can't divorce one from the other. It's kind of all integrated today. And so we are able to also manage this process, in a work environment where we're able to repurpose people. And it's about taking this bold bet, oftentimes, right? And almost taking away the old playbooks of yesteryear, where it was structured, it was almost, everybody stays in their swim lane. That thinking needs to change fundamentally.
Yeah. I do want to come to Robin, but after Fergus, because I want to delve deeper into, where skills development needs to start and where laser focus needs to be. And also, Tebogo, also just for you to just park with this question as well on accountability in environmentally irresponsible practices. But what does the cycle of employment look like in e-waste?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we did some numbers yesterday, and we started off as a printer cartridge collector. We were keeping printer cartridges out of landfill. And this year so far, we've bought printer cartridges from 570 different cartridge brokers. That's just printer cartridges. If you extend that to laptops and PCs and servers, I think it can grow enormously. Yeah, so I think
it's robust.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's part of this informal economy that we don't really know about.
Yeah,
that pulled us through COVID. That keeps us going. That's the resourcefulness of our people. It's an amazing thing to see and wonderful people to deal with.
All right. Well, as I mentioned, Robin, where does skills development need to start, and where focus needs to be in that education and employment ecosystem to be able to develop a sustainable transition?
So the skills development part needs to start, the minute that we even have the concept, like we start to conceptualize an idea. One of the things that we advocate for and that we struggle with is that we see plans and strategies in place without thinking about the skills development part, and then we try to tack that on after the fact. We see that in many different areas. So Schneider is one of our levy payers, and our lab, like Devin has said it all, for example, in terms of how we require that multi-prong approach, a very deep collaboration in order to strengthen the skills base. He touched on a lot of the points around how we can't just look at like certification and accredited qualifications anymore. We're moving much more into the space, which is great because it allows us to be responsive and quick and agile and adaptive into the space of that sort of on-the-job or practical learning that's not necessarily formally certified, and we're getting a lot more into the space of recognition of prior learning. Once you've learned on the job, we add on the theoretical learning for you to be able to grow your business beyond a certain point, because with the sort of informal learning and the learning online and that sort of thing, the short courses, you can get up to a certain point, but if you're wanting to break into big business, for example, and be part of their value chains, there are requirements that would come with that. So there's so much to be done. There's so much to be done. Our TVET system is not producing the quality graduates at the rate that it needs to. And by quality graduates, what we are finding in our research is that increasingly, and it's in line with global discourse as well, increasingly the discussion around skills is not about the technical and the hands-on anymore. It's actually about the ability to problem solve, to navigate complexity, navigate change. And so, those are the things that this is where it comes to building the plane while flying it. Because it's learning on the fly. There's so much new information emerging all the time. And yes, that I do just want to again echo that collaborative approach that's required. So like I said, our TVET system suffers from a historical and systematic, just as a basis, underfunding, but governance, management, leadership challenges. And that's what we've inherited, what we sit with today. when we strengthen and capacitate that system, we're strengthening and capacitating for sake of the country, as opposed to doing our own individual, business intake, and we just train for our own pipeline. You can't hold on to that. That skill, that person, that individual is flexible to go where they need to go. So one of the things we also advocate for is in the investment that we make, the resources that we invest in skills development, and I love the way that you've put it, Devin, that we're not just investing in our own business pipeline, but also just in a pipeline of people who can then go out and land where they land. Yes, there are challenges with the quality of education, for sure. There are changes that need to happen for sure, and they need to happen faster. But there is a marked difference between the rate of unemployment of an unskilled and untrained person versus a trained person. There is a difference in that unemployment rate if you break down those two populations. So, yeah, from a skills development perspective, that's where we're at. And with all of those issues, really, the skills conversation must start right at conception to take all of these things into account.
Yeah.
And during the process, being adaptable and flexible all the time to the new information that emerges.
All right. I do want to come to you, Teboho, on accountability. What is the level of accountability for companies that make their profits in environmentally and socially irresponsible ways? Also, I'm not sure if you mostly deal with the listed space, because I also just want to know how far that accountability goes beyond companies that are listed, those that aren't listed as well.
Sure. So we deal with both sides. And I think with the market developing and the infrastructure, accountability is embedded in every space. So we spoke about the CBAM, the European tax. So if we import, say, you mentioned, Divan mentioned in the car industry, most of our cars that we export, 77% of them go to Europe. And that's embedded in that, it's the carbon tax that we have to think about it. So regulation is moving, which is a form of accountability. On the listed side, the JSE released the guidance for companies to disclose their environmental activities, the nature capital of your product or service, and its touch points. So that's accountability. And with that framework, the same way that there's IFRS auditing for accounting, there's now IFRS for sustainability, where not only do you report your sustainability, but it will be audited. So that's also pressure that's coming. But also as investors, we see usually when we have AGMs, there's resolutions that are normal on governance side, on remuneration and director re-election. We're seeing more and more push for ESG-related resolutions. So we want to vote on a climate resolutions. We want a company to tell us, do you have a net zero plan and can we vote off it? Did you stress test it? Is it science-based or is it just a plan? How are you going to meet it? More push for board members and companies to start having those sustainability committees, and we as shareholders want to vote on that. So I think from all sides there is. And lastly, as an investor, there's more capital, I think mostly from Europe and other parties or development finance, that particularly wants to invest in sustainable products or projects. And I mean, as a company, you want to position yourself to that. Corporates can issue green bonds or sustainability bonds where they promise that, we're raising these bonds, we want to use the proceeds to improve or, build some R&D for transition. So there's definitely regulation, but also there's also an attraction, an opportunity to also raise cheaper capital to transition at this time.
All right. Well, we are getting closer to the question and answer session. Of course, to our viewers that are tuned in virtually, there is a live chat function there where you can post your questions, but we also do have a mic in the venue, so you can start getting your questions ready. But in the meantime, as we head to the end of the conversation, I do want to get last words from each of the panelists. And I actually just want to start off with you, Fergus, your last words, and particularly the future opportunities and the view of recycling being the next big industrial play.
Sure, that's a big one, yeah. I think we spoke about the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. A lithium-ion battery is going to have a life cycle. Within that, there's cobalt, there's lithium, there's nickel. There are elements with value. Research says that those elements, if drawn out correctly, can be used again, as well as a new battery. So it's so important. I mean, I don't know the numbers, but the amount of solar panels and batteries that are out there now, it's enormous. So I think it's something that needs to be looked at. It probably needs to be formalized, because it is a pretty informal space at the moment. I know that the DFFE has done fantastic work in terms of the end user responsibility program, ensuring that people are accountable for what they bring in or what they manufacture. So for me, I think it's a huge play. It's a great, it's an exciting space to be in. The job creation, it should boom. I'm hoping it'll boom. Yeah, and so from our side, I think it's a great space to be in.
All right. I want to come to you, Robin, as well, as we close off the conversation before the Q&A session. Just your last words in terms of skills, education, where the laser focus needs to be on.
I think the name of the game is collaboration. That we don't just work in our individual silos. An example of that in our space, because we're in the energy and water sector, our focus is heavily on technical and vocational skills. We try to capacitate TVET colleges, but there's, unless there's some sort of business in those area, in the area where TVET college is located, that is willing to, for example, avail their workplace for learners to get practical learning, and to work together with the college, it just becomes people who you're training for unemployment, and the same business will complain about the quality of that graduate when they finish. So that's just one example, but I think as private and public sector and civil society, the name of the game is collaboration from a skills development perspective.
All right. And then on your side, David, just your last words as well, anything that maybe we haven't touched on, but also your key considerations when you assist manufacturers in product innovation, automation, and all of that. What needs to be considered by these companies, and also what you bring to the fore?
Yeah, thanks. So I think the point we discussed earlier, so you can't separate the two, right? You can't separate your business process from sustainability. It has to be integrated. And I think on that note, there's components of this greening that is so germane to good business practice. When you look at the frugality that is associated with sustainable living, and you superimpose that on your business processes, immediately you're going to have a lot more productivity. You're going to have, it's a natural consequence of taking a bit more rigor, taking a bit more diligence with respect to when you, for example, want to run a process, right? Considering that energy's got a time of use tariff. So that information is one of the most simplistic examples I can bring, where we as digital partners for our customers are bringing this information to them automatically, virtually, and using cloud computing with a large layer of software and data analytics, making these decisions automatically. Because we know today, for example, the time of use tariffs, Eskom charges these tariffs at different rates of the day. Now, it doesn't take a person to go and switch on a boiler or switch on a manufacturing process at that moment. It happens automatically. And this is really where, we start with building blocks with our partners and customers, starting to build the infrastructure at a connected level. So when we talk about digital electronics, as an example, you cannot have anything digital and connected if there's no fundamental foundational building block. And then on top of that, you overlay where all of this information gets collated. And on top of that, you put in this apps and analytics layer, which then gives you information available on your tablet, on your smartphone, or whatever to make informed decisions and to be able to operate your plant or your household appliances and so on. So that's really where it's going. And this is enshrouded within the new energy landscape. We also talk about another concept, which is called a prosumer. And I'd like to maybe spend maybe a minute on this. The prosumer today, and all of you that have rooftop solar as an example, ultimately you are a combination of a consumer on the one hand, because you're consuming when you're connected to the Eskom grid or the utility grid, and you are prosuming you're providing or you're producing energy when you've got surplus capacity. Now today, we talk about this collaborative space between government and institutions like regulators. All of this needs to kind of make sense. In the Northern Hemisphere, and Europe in particular, it's a lot more advanced with respect to having policy and frameworks in place where you, as a private individual, prosumer as an example, want to sell excess capacity back into the grid. It's easy to do that, enabled by the technology we provide, to have the metering, to have the technology to be able to wheel that electricity back into the grid and get paid for it or offset against your account. All of this happening automatically. So there's a huge inflection point insofar as the digital revolution is concerned, and bringing your, what you call static plant into an intelligence mode, which then takes advantage of this frugality and the sustainability and all of that, driving this business improvement. So in conclusion, I think, greening for me is just way beyond just being a socially correct or politically correct company. It's more around looking at your own operation, running it a lot more competitively, and having a differentiator, which again is part of any business practice.
All right. Let's come to you, Teboho, lastly, and also maybe just touch on the mechanisms that asset managers are using to finance green investments, but also how easy or difficult is it to measure that positive impact?
It's not so hard because now we have frameworks like I mentioned the green taxonomy, which is really, really helpful. It gives us a similar taxonomy for all investors to agree, or even the participant, on what is green, what is not green. We have SDGs, which are really good framework, global framework, and under each SDGs there are sub-indicators which show you what's a positive SDG or not. So it's more than just aligning with an SDG. You actually have to measure it. So with all the frameworks, which are good, and with that you can benchmark because we're measuring the same thing, it is a bit easier to see. In investment, most sectors are moving there. So now in our property portfolio, you have to have a green license. You have to be a green building, which is certified. And for the old buildings, in your maintenance, you try and move it there. If we're looking at in our fixed income, which is on the list, that we try to find more green bonds or sustainability bonds. And then there's infrastructure projects where we invest in renewables or water. But I guess in closing is the world is transitioning to a more greener economy. And I think we do need to give it that agency, because the slower we are, the less prepared we get, and the more jobs we lose. Thinking also if in the manufacturing with this carbon border tax, we'll lose so many jobs. If we think in the car manufacturing, we know how many small businesses were impacted by load shedding. So the slower we are, actually the social, in the long term, we lose on both the E and the S. So it's not a good idea.
Yeah, all right. Well, thank you so much for that. The conversation has come to an end on my side, but of course now we are entering into the question and answer session. So if our audience in the venue can prepare your questions, but there is a question online. Is there an attempt to bring skilled regular guys who are either self-taught or gain skills and experience over time to some level of compliance so they can equally compete in the business world? Besides running skills development courses, we have high-skilled people who informally engage in different businesses but cannot grow because of compliance. Robin, would that be for you? I think you also mentioned that on some level, it isn't about skills, but it's about being able to navigate change, but also having the ability to problem solve.
Correct. From the compliance perspective, so I actually think that those sorts of skills actually reside with people sometimes who haven't necessarily been formally trained, because they've had to problem solve like every step of the way. They've had to navigate like strange environments and interesting scenarios every step of the way. But yes, then from a compliance perspective, as I mentioned, you sometimes get to a point where you actually need to have literally the paper to show someone and say, I'm a certified this or that. So I would encourage the individual who asked the question to look at routes like recognition of prior learning, which is a process by which you do an assessment upfront from a technical perspective to say, like, how strong is your book knowledge? We assume that you've got the practical knowledge, and then what are the gaps in your book, your textbook knowledge, and those gaps can be filled. There's many providers for that. Towards artisanship, towards formal qualifications, recognition of prior learning is definitely something to look into from that perspective, and that we advocate for, as I mentioned earlier, more and more, because we realize that there's a lot of people out there who have learned on the job, and there's actually nothing wrong with the way that they went about it.
All right. Well, let's get to our audience. There is a mic available, so if you can just raise your hand so that the mic can come to you and you can ask a question. But also, please, can you let us know who the question is directed to? And you can also introduce yourself as you ask the question.
My name is Lucas Zeki. I'm the former Group CEO of Conco, and I'm an investor and the founder of Zeki Enterprises. I'm uncertain who my question is actually directed to, but perhaps it's a societal dilemma that we all have to contemplate. According to a scientist called Professor Vaclav Sivel, he says that about 3.1 billion people, that largely many of them reside in sub-Saharan Africa, are actually using energy equivalent that was achieved in France and Germany in 1860. So our energy consumption per capita of some 3.1 billion people in 2020 all over the world was equivalent to the standard of living that was achieved in France and Germany in 1860. So we sincerely have a massive ethical dilemma that we have to deal with as modern society, that how do we contribute towards bringing dignified living of standard for those 3 billion people. Ideally, we would want their energy consumption per capita to either double, preferably triple, for them to achieve a dignified standard of living for food production, for world-class transportation systems, access to healthcare, education, and all the beautiful social amenities we're enjoying in modern society. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Lucas, Devin?
Yeah, I'll give it a stab. So you're absolutely spot on, and I think it's an area when we look at our purpose as a company, as an example, we look at it on two fronts. On the one hand, we look at the existing economy that is thriving, and that you talked about France, Germany, and the most parts of developed world, that it's almost inconceivable to live without electricity today, right? And on the other hand, you've got this disenfranchised, huge swathes of people that don't have access to energy. Now, one of the limiting factors of why that is the case is that the energy, the energy value chain, as it were, was centralized. In fact, it's still centralized largely. So you're talking about a power station that then transmits power, over large distances. Then it gets to a distribution center and it's distributed. And so urban and peri-urban become the biggest recipients of this infrastructure, installed base. But what happens to rural parts of, the world that are far removed from this infrastructure? And before long, or before recent, this was, the energy sources that were used were other than electricity. So it was, wood burning, coal, other sources, gas potentially, but really, also contributing to this carbon crisis that we have, right? So today, with energy storage, with distributed energy resources, DERs, microgrids, which is aimed at decentralizing this energy infrastructure, we are able to have production in situ. So production in situ or in close proximity to where the consumption is happening. So you think about that today, it's a game changer, right? Because now you're not waiting for some authority or some government to decide that they have a master plan to put out an infrastructure which will cost significant amounts of investment. You're talking about a much smaller scale, that is able to be very portable, quickly mobilized, cost-effective, and being able to run through energy storage systems, as an example, and manage communities from there and so on. And you know, the industrial sector is the first mover on this, typically. So if you look at oil and gas, the sector, oil and gas sectors, and you look at the mining sectors, these are, you know, sectors that are far removed today from urban and peri-urban centers. And how do you get you know, energy to these remote sites? Oftentimes, because they're large energy consumers, it was profitable for an ESCOM or some other power utility to transmit electricity to them, because they knew they had long-term tenure and they could, you know, get return on investment. But if you look at communities that are, you know, consuming 50 kilowatts of power, that does not make it viable for a large energy company to distribute. But it makes it very viable for a community to procure a microgrid, or you know, a company to procure a microgrid to be able to you know, provide electricity. And today we find, for example, a lot of NGOs, and that's where we play a significant role in access to energy, where we also have solutions as simple as a you know, as an inverter that can be used in a rural setting with the solar panel, just giving somebody the dignity, as you mentioned, of having access to digital access, to have internet, to have access to a television set or a tablet, to have you know, a light to be able to read and do homework, etc., and beyond that, cook you know, without having to cut down trees for wood burning stoves. So that's the revolution, I believe, that is taking place, and you know, bringing a lot of dignity to the people that have been otherwise forgotten because of the circumstances that they find themselves in.
Right. Well, I do have to mention that we are running out of time. We have actually run out of time. But if we can please keep the questions and the answers tight as well. So where is the next question coming from? There in the middle. Oh, there. Okay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Moses Utlwari from Kabelo Maintenance and Logistics. Maybe the first question, in fact, is about the topic, like green economy. So I'm sorry, maybe I'm naive. What is green economy, first? And then the second one is to Mr. Lucas about Schneider Electricity. I've heard about him speaking about, it seems like it's waste to energy or something like that, if I'm not mistaken. But there's a solar and then there's a waste to energy. So how are we, what's the difference in solar and in waste to energy in terms of benefiting? Like the solar, how does it do it for the people to benefit, and waste to energy, how does the people make them to benefit? And on that one, continuously, is like, there's a BRICS summit. The China brought almost 670 million equipment to salvage our electricity in ESCOM. So the Schneider Electricity, its role, maybe I think it comes maybe in local communities, because of ESCOM, it's something that is up. So Schneider, how does it bring to make people aware that you can sustain or teach people how to make waste to energy, and how can we maintain it to go further? Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to try and answer this succinctly as possible, right?
Yes, all right, thank you.
Okay, so I think it's a very elaborate question. Firstly, I'm going to come back to the waste to energy and the renewable part and solar, right? So, of course, these are areas of production of electricity today that have both positive and negative implications. When you look at the waste to energy part, on the one hand, it's taking stuff that's going to end up in a landfill, and that's taking its calorific value and turning it into heat, and obviously driving a turbine and generating electricity. There's still an element of carbon in that particular process of generating electricity. When you look at renewables, as in solar, it is completely renewable. There's absolutely zero carbon emission in that process alone. So when you compare the two, of course, there's the cost implications on both, capital on one hand, operating on the other hand, but the implications in terms of this greening of economy, one certainly surpasses the other. So I would say if you have the choice, renewable, especially in sunny South Africa, the choice should always be in favor and biasing towards solar.
All right. There was a question here as well, if I'm not mistaken, in the middle.
Yeah, I think it's me. My name is Siyabonga Tusi. I don't know if you guys can hear me. I work for a company called Shoba Realty. It's actually in collaboration with...
If you can maybe get closer to the mic.
I don't know. Yeah,
there
can you guys hear me?
There we go.
Okay. Yeah, so Shoba Realty, it's a Dubai company. So it's sort of like an innovation type of a smart city type of a company. So, I mean, I've been in sort of like an island. I've been looking for investors to actually, invest in the lens area. I don't know if you guys know about lens area, a smart city project, which was announced by Mr. Ramaphosa with time he was actually sworn in. So again, I just wanted to know in terms of how are we going to move in terms of moving in terms of the pivotal point from one step to another, because now we're seeing, the educational system that we have, it's not actually benefiting us. I mean, Robin, I'm an electrical engineer and I just quit on the career. I'm seeing artificial intelligence taking place, and the field itself is not actually pivoting into that term. So I just wanted to know how is the renewal and everything it's going to be taking place.
Would that be directed to
Robin? In terms of educational system and artificial intelligence and all those stuff. I mean, you can go to universities. Professors are not actually taking educational system in the first steps. So I just wanted to know if that educational system will be changed in such a way.
There's a lot of initiatives underway that take into account the issues that you're speaking about around, I guess, transforming the way that we deliver and receive education and skills development. And there are pockets where we are leading. So at certain universities, at certain institutions, they are further ahead. But I completely agree that there's still a lot of change needed in our overall education system, because right now we can't say overall that we've got a great education system. It starts, the issues are like how long is a piece of string, because it starts at early childhood development stage. Basic education says they inherit certain issues. Higher education, you inherit certain issues, and at the end of the day, you've got a person who has a desire to to receive an education, who applies themselves, and at the end of the day, given economic circumstances, they might not even receive the benefit of that education as they had envisioned it. So there are pockets of excellence. It is an ongoing discussion. How do we bring virtual reality, AI, basically, what do we call it? I can't remember what it's called, but how do we bring elements of the fourth industrial revolution, as an example, into our education system? And as I say, in some spaces there is work happening in certain institutions, and the drive is towards upgrading, leveling up the education system.
All right. Well, we have run out of time. I'd like to thank our audience virtually and also here in the venue for engaging with this topic. There was one more question, but I guess, Tebogo, please, can you give our viewers, the audience, maybe a site in which they can go? Because one was asking about your approach to startups and also just your investment strategy. So where can people go for that information?
So in general, let me just answer the general, how do you find funding? So if you want funding, I think the best way is just look at where your business plays. So some funds are very specific, like we fund tech startups or green startups. So just look at the whole universe of funds that exist, asset managers. That's a lot of work. But also try find the ones that their mandate fits very well to your business, because you've cut off the work for them. They don't have to screen and say wrong door. So if it fits, find which space do they play with, your sector, and if they align to any of the SDGs or green funding or taxonomy. But for your business as well, just find out which of the sustainability angle it takes, be clear on that, articulate it well, and align it to a fund that's looking to fund businesses that play in that space.
All right. Well, thank you so much to all of you. Just thanking my panelists, Devon Pillay, the Cluster President for the Anglophone Africa region at Schneider Electric, Robin Vilakazi, the Chief Financial Officer at the Energy and Water Sector Education and Training Authority, that's the EWCTA, and also Tebuo Makabane, who is the Head of ESG and Impact at Sanlam Investments, and Fergus Slattery, who is the Director at CF Africa. Well, they say that don't look at another person's grass, but rather water your own grass. But what if we could look at each other's patches of grasses and actually water each other's patches of grasses? And that is what the next panel discussion is about. So I will be handing over to Nastasia Arnsa. Thank you very much.
All right, so we much to the panelists. That was a fantastic conversation. And I did see hands that were still up of people who wanted to ask questions, but I do ask that please stay behind at the end of the event. I think our guests will still be available. They can come, they can actually answer your questions. What we're going to do now, we were meant to take a 15-minute comfort break, but I'm going to cut it down to 5 minutes. So we're going to take a 10-minute comfort break, and this is where you can stretch, go to the restrooms, get a cup of coffee, and then we're going to reconvene back here at 11 o'clock sharp. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are now going to continue with the rest of the program. If you can kindly find your seats, and then I know a lot of the people who are online are also looking forward to the next panel. So the first panel was quite interesting, and there might be some elements and some themes that come out of the first panel, or rather that came out of the first panel, that we might actually build forward into this particular one. So this panel is titled The Road to Energy Security, Bridging International Borders. And I've got a fantastic set of panelists who are going to be joining us. And I'm going to be introducing them to join me on stage, starting off with Stuart McWilliam. He is the head of strategy and M&A at Mulilo. And then we have AJ Lala, who's the project development specialist at Lesedi. And in the audience, I did see Thabo Molekoa, who's the chairman and managing director of Siemens Energy Southern Africa. And if we can have back on stage Devin Pillay, who's the cluster president for Anglophone Africa at Schneider Electric. And then Kolisa Dlamini, who's the head of sustainability operations and impact at Sanlam. Thank you so much for joining me on stage. So as I mentioned, that this particular panel is going to be looking at energy security and bridging international borders. And part of the discussion, we're going to try and weave in where the role of policymakers fits in, and also touch on the narrative around the energy transition. And the reason why we want to start off with that is that when the other panel was on and we were going through the Q&A session, somebody stood up and said, well, what is green energy? And I think it was a very important question, because as we sit here as corporates and institutions and we're having these conversations, especially in the financial world, and people read about it, they don't know how they fit into it, and those who know, so they're able to think about how it affects them. So let's start off with that right from the very top. The conversation around a just transition and the narrative and the way we've been telling the story. Where are we right now, and what do we need to change in that narrative and how we tell that story? AJ, let's start off with you.
So the just transition is aimed to be just, and there needs to be a transition. So currently we face three challenges in South Africa out of these, which impacts the climate changes, is our poverty, our inequality, and our carbon emissions. So the just transition in South Africa at the moment, frameworks have been set in, there's presidential councils that are put in place, but it's a work in progress. So we're not really attacking this as we should. It's a work in progress, stakeholders, NEDLEC, XYZ is work done. We're looking at it in the senses of, gender equality, but it's not the focus on climate mitigation. And I think we've got targets set in place, but we have no implementation plans on how we're going to meet that. And that's clear that we see. From an international perspective, there's been lots of investments in the REAP rounds since 2011. It fell off in 2015, and then today we're sitting with a problem with Eskom. So the just transition, even though it's taken a lot of previous history of South Africa, but we haven't implemented policies that maintained. Most of the production plants, most of the, Schneider Electric is sitting with us. They were shareholder of Soleil Direct. They invested. We had a module manufacturing plant in South Africa, but we closed it down in 2016. Jinko is here present today. They had a module manufacturing. We closed it down. Today we're sitting with the crisis, and every house, if you look at it today, has PV panels, but they're not manufactured in South Africa. So the Just in Transition plan has failed as far as I'm concerned. We're not looking at that. I read something the other day, we sign in, and I think we are, with a Chinese manufacturer for module availability in South Africa. But for me, that's actually from a competitions board. We have one module manufacturing left in South Africa. The Just in Transition for me at the moment, from a climate resilience or from a manufacturing, the green economy, is not matching up with that. I don't see how we creating and alleviating poverty and gender equality. Sorry, I don't want to carry on.
Thanks.
All right. Let's see. Do you share the same views, Gulisa, and then we'll get comments from Thabo in a bit. I mean, how are you viewing the state of the just transition right now?
Okay, to your question around the narrative and the discourse, I think we're facing a very big challenge when it comes to the discourse and the narrative, because what I've observed is that when we're having a conversation around climate, we isolate aspects of climate. So climate action comprises of mitigation, adaptation, and transition is an integral part of that. So when you're having a conversation about the just transition, you cannot have that conversation without having a conversation about mitigation and the impacts of what you're doing for mitigation in terms of influencing adaptation, in order to move our economies and our people to a greener economy. And the reason why I'm phrasing it that way is because when you then look at some of the narratives, I think the previous moderator touched on this when she mentioned the narrative around, saving jobs in the fossil fuels industry, because that speaks to how energy is generated. But we need to understand that when you're generating energy using fossil fuels, it actually then impedes what we're trying to achieve through mitigation. And it impacts us, the same economies, quite negatively when you see what happens with the extreme weather patterns that people are experiencing. So now the conversation focuses on so much on the E that it's not necessarily moving into, okay, the impact of what we're doing or not doing when it comes to mitigation actually impacts what we can achieve when it comes to adaptation, because if our weather patterns and our extreme weather patterns are this way, we need to then make our people, that S part then comes in, to be able to adapt to this changing environment. So for me, for instance, when it comes to the argument for fossil fuels, I'm not convinced it's actually, from an economics perspective, it's actually a sensible argument when you look at the bigger picture. So I think the narrative needs to move away from a forest, move away from looking at the tree, but looking at the forest. And I think that's how I'd like to put it.
So it's a nice analogy. Tawa, do you share that? That we need to be looking at it holistically as opposed to trying to isolate different parts and expect people to sort of follow through with it and be on board?
I think quite correct. And maybe also to phrase it differently so we have a good starting point. So our stance has been, as a technology provider, we've looked at, we serve quite an integrated value chain of technologies. And our conclusion it comes to the point that actually it's a social dialogue project that we are embarking on. Technology is not the core focus of where we need to be, but more around the socio-economic conversations we need to be having. And the centrality of it for us, especially for energy transition, will be how do you provide sustainable, affordable, and reliable energy? And that's a dialogue that we need to have around this transition to this low carbon economy, and realize as well, also what was mentioned, is that it's a step-by-step approach, because you don't want to leave anyone behind. The earlier panel spoke about skills. Skills is also central to that. So is providing for jobs, so are the manufacturing and so on. And I think if we pace ourselves, we can actually stand to gain a bit more than what we think.
Stuart, your thoughts in having that social dialogue, but also thinking about integrating that social justice into the conversation and the broader conversation, that is?
For me, one of the challenges is that I think just transition has become almost a zero-sum game. It's the focus on how do we shift coal to renewables, and how do we worry about the 92,000 people that are employed in the South African coal value chain? And I think then it's almost a climate versus jobs, right? And you can't really eat climate, so people choose jobs, so then you want to keep the coal. And the question, I think, is can we take a step back and say, do renewables is it really a zero-sum game? If you look at sort of from South Africa on a longer-term basis, South Africa was industrialized off coal, right? It was our competitive advantage. We had cheap coal plus minerals, gave us industrialization. And that's the economy we have today. And today we have no power, right? Which is very expensive power. We had cheap power, we had industrialization. Today we have no power, very expensive as such. And now the question is, can we almost change the narrative around, can this transition be to a longer term environment in South Africa where we have a new competitive advantage, which is our solar and solar resources and wind resources. I think we have double amount of sun than the UK, right? They're 238th in the world in sun, we're 15th. And in that transition, you go back to cheap electricity, which is cheap electricity drives industrialization. So you're almost changing the narrative around worrying about the 92,000 jobs, which we have to worry about, but more worried about the 15 million jobs in South Africa and say, can renewables, can the transition lead to effectively South Africa regaining its competitive advantage through tapping into renewables and therefore sort of talk about the jobs we're going to grow rather than just the jobs that are going to be lost in the current transition.
On that note then, Devin, you're no stranger on this stage. A lot of the audience members and the viewers got to hear your thoughts and where, Schneider Electric fits into all of that. But how do we prioritize what's important for our country, especially when we have these competing interests? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I think Tebogo, talked about it, and Stuart as well to some extent. It is a transition. Right, and it is. I think that's the defining concept here. It's because these are such massive tectonic shifts that need to take place. It can't happen instantaneously. There's just too many parameters to consider. Right, it's economic constructs, social constructs, it's financial, and these are massive, monumental movements. Skills. These things are not going to happen overnight. I'll take a typical example. We have a project currently operating in East Africa. So between Uganda and Tanzania, it's an oil pipeline, right? And again, bad swear word in a green economy discussion when you talk about fossil fuel oil. But this is a pipeline that is transporting oil and gas from the Uganda Lake Victoria Basin 1,500 kilometers through the Serengeti forest. Again, another, very bad, and I hope there's no Greenpeace guys standing outside. But, and then all the way to Dar es Salaam to ship onto vessels, removing this oil and gas. And the reason I'm telling you the story is that in this current situation, Total is the owner of this pipeline. And we're participating as Schneider Electric in terms of the electrification of this route, etc. But it's got so much of criticism with respect to it's just ill-conceived timing. It's aiming to displace forests, people, settlements, all of that. And this conversation has been going on for the better part of 5 to 10 years, right? And it has so many parallels to our situation here as well, because ultimately those communities today are all potentially, becoming part of this, taking part of this economic revival that's happening in the East African community on the basis of this production of oil. And as much as, and this is why I say it's such a contradictory element of our being, right? On one hand, we know today we are struggling because all we have today is we've got this capacity of 80% of our energy produced by coal-fired power stations. We're all trying desperately to navigate towards a renewable part. So we've got an element of free market that's going to take place where it makes willing buyer, willing seller propositions viable so that ultimately you as a consumer can make choices as to whether you want to stay on the grid or whether you want to go on to buy a solar system that keeps you off grid. And that's not going to happen overnight either, because it takes technology to drive, R&D and investments towards making this a bit more affordable. Coming back to the ECOP scenario, the change for the communities there and the way Total has argued this whole, investment, those communities are going to be recipients of byproducts of gas from this pipeline. Today, the rate of deforestation in that area, because people have no access to reliable clean energy, is this the whole diametrically opposed conversation that we're just talking about right now, right? So these things have to be, they're complex matters, and I don't think any one particular forum is going to have answers, but it's a matter of being able to bring everybody to the table, consider all the moving parts and the implications of this from a stakeholder base, and drive it forward. So to your point, it's not going to be just about jobs in coal and moving to renewable. It's a much wider discussion point to have.
Lisa, I want to come to you here because the audience may not know this, but if they read your bio, you also have an academic background. And if I'm not mistaken, you authored a chapter that looks at investing for impact on the African continent.
That's right.
And tying into what Devin has said and some of the aspects you've brought forward, do you find that financial institutions, from a mindset perspective, approach the financing of the transition, or looking at it, as you say, the forest as opposed to one part of the tree differently? And how do we change that? And perhaps we can incorporate some of the stuff you bring out, especially when we want to invest for impact then.
Thank you. Yes, the quick answer is yes, they do it differently. And I think part of it is how the conversation is happening, where there's almost a one-dimensional view of a multi-dimensional issue, and as complex as you have described it, right? But I think when you then look at how financing is happening, one of the big issues, I think sometimes it's not necessarily clear to what extent allocators of capital are thinking again in a more holistic way when they are choosing what they want to allocate capital to. Sometimes it is structural to say, okay, we can then invest in generating power, and you're seeing the renewable energy projects, a lot of money is going into the generation. But we have a huge issue of transmission. And I think the question earlier, in the earlier panel, alluded to that. We need to get energy to the people who need it. So if you are not seeing money go into transmission and distribution, then it becomes potentially problematic, because you're now going to have these huge energy producing, investments, but you're not necessarily getting, the power to where it's needed. And then it starts speaking into justice issues then, to say, okay, the idea is to make sure that everyone on our continent has power. So if it's produced, but we are not seeing transmission getting the capital that it needs, then we're going to have a big problem. And I think part of that is because some investors or allocators of capital, in their mindset, would then focus on one thing, to say, okay, we are looking at Paris, Paris Agreement. We need to mitigate, so we're going to build renewable energy. But on the ground, and even similar to that issue, where now people who live there, where the actual stuff is sourced, is getting the byproduct. And in that process, it tells us that transmission and distribution are a big issue that needs to be taken advantage of, or at least taken seriously and given the attention, not only from allocators of capital, but also even policymakers around how to make sure that that energy transition is just for the people and the economies that they managing.
All right. AJ, I saw you in between as Xolisa was making his point. You were nodding there. The aspects of the point that he's brought forward that you agree with here.
Yes.
You're happy with that? Okay.
Yeah.
Spot on.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thabo, let me come to you here, because I'm curious to know some of the work that Siemens Southern Africa has seen, the kind of collaboration we've seen on the ground as we look at some of the partners on the continent. What has Siemens been engaging in recently? What can you share here?
So, what's opportunity to talk about Siemens Energy? No problem. I think So I think at the heart of what we wanted to do, and I say wanted to do because we're not there yet, it's around the sense of, we have a phrase which is say energizing society. And if you look at that phrase, we will talk about some of the issues around generation and transmission, right, and storage of electricity. We've seen, obviously, the load shedding challenges, and we've raised our hands to support there. But the heart of it is really how you maintain the current infrastructure and start to introduce a conversation about how do we transition to what we want to get to, which is a pure renewable energy. And we see gas as an instrument there. And I think we often talk about why don't we work on progress as opposed to perfection? So we want to get to renewables and storage, and the economics are not supporting us there. So why don't we transition ourselves to gas, have a significant reduction in CO2, about 60% or so, And then once you're busy with that, then focus on some of the efficiency improvements. So that could be automating our processes to help to decarbonize some of the industries. And that's part of the work that we're doing in that space. And then obviously looking into the future, then it's a conversation of once you've prepared your grid, you've expanded your grid, and you're able to integrate a lot of the renewables, then let's start talking about how do we massively scale up on green hydrogen, because that's going to help us to try and help to decarbonize some of the sectors.
If I could just step in on that, that's actually true, and that's just to elaborate. I mean, today we're looking at PV, and we must realize renewable is not dispatchable. We can't turn it on at 10 o'clock tonight. The thing of the grid, you know, you look at the Northern Cape, you look at all the projects that are developed, they can't evacuate back into the grid. It's a classic case with Vedanta Steel, Vedanta Zinc that wants to put in back behind the meter to compensate 30 megawatt for their use of Black Mountain. But they can't do that at the moment with Eskom because the grid is so unstable that if you take in 28 megawatt off and what they use, so it creates grid instability. Today you're looking at renewables not being dispatchable, it's coupled with gas to power. So you know, if you're looking at a gas to power hybrid system, when we did risk mitigation, we had a project that we, from a Lesedi perspective, where you wanted dispatchability between 5:30 in the morning and 9:30 in the evening, 17 hours. But your peaks in the morning, you know, you've got dispatchability with gas to power, given at 100 megawatt from 5 o'clock in the morning, and these things are ramped up in 30 minutes. And then you taper down the gas as the sun increases with PV. So you decarbonize, so it's not the cleanest, it's better than at the moment coal, but it's not the cleanest, but you'll use at least, you reduce the consumption of gas by about 45%. So it's still 55% of gas consumption, but you're looking at PV generating, and you know, as PV reaches the peak, you taper down, and as the sun sets, you taper up with weather intermittency with climate change. You know, the dispatchability is available. But that's a transition that we, you know, that today we're looking at. Today we don't have access to gas, and gas is our problem. And if you're getting into gas, the variable cost or the fixed cost is certain, but the variable cost being the commodity as gas, you know, makes the cost of electricity going. So there's hurdles in that, but from a piloting perspective, green hydrogen will come in definitely to filter into that. So, but then again, we rely on the international markets, the cross-border, for investment in, because I think looking at our current country needs, investment into the hydrogen industry is highly untangible for South Africa. You know, I'm taking, when we're looking at today, when I started in industry, we created a solar manufacturing plant in South Africa. I bought cells for $2.50, right? And that was a 250 watt module we made. And today I'm buying cells, so $2.50 was equivalent at 1 to 9. At that time our exchange rate was 9 rands to the euro. And we paid about 23 rands per watt. Today in 2023, we're buying it for 3 rand 90. As opposed to 23 rands in 2008. We buy it for 3 rand 90. If our exchange rate, which is 1 to 18 or $19 to the euro, if our exchange rate was stable, we would buy it for 2 rands. You know, so we've decreased 83% of the cell pricing, you know, on efficiency from a 250 watt module to a 900 watt module. So technology, and I think one of your questions, technology has advanced. Today we're looking at inverters, balance of plants, we're looking at efficiency. We find that efficiency come into place. We've got trackers, we've got smart string inverters, you've got central inverters. Technology is morphing itself. Battery is coming down in price, it's a future, but I believe that it's not a full transition. But we have mechanisms, and green hydrogen will filter in towards the 240s in South Africa, and not immediately in the next 10 years.
Stuart, your thoughts on the green hydrogen, and I think we've had quite a lot of these conversations over the past few months, especially on the stage where a lot has been brought forward or been punted. Some have brought in the idea of nuclear, various other things have been brought forward here. Where does all of that fit in the value chain, in the conversation that we want to push forward to the broader parts of the communities around the green economy?
I think for me is the fact this is a transition, right? Transition talks to change over a period of time, where a lot of the conversation is around things changing today. And the gentleman was saying is, with looking over the next 30 years, you probably can have all of the above, right? Coal is going to be, Medupi and Kusile will be there producing electricity for the next 30 years. We need solar, we're going to need wind, we're going to need gas to fill in the mix. But the challenge comes if you want to get to by 2050, when everyone talks about a full renewable energy environment, effectively no fossil fuels, you have to then also look at the hard-to-abate industries, effectively industries where electricity can't almost replace an input cost, input substance in chemical plants or in steel, right? They actually need, it's not just electricity you need actually physical, the coal provides another element. And I think that's where your green hydrogen will definitely play a part, is if you want to go to 100% renewables, not everything can be electricity-based. Hydrogen, in a way, is energy. Green hydrogen is taking energy from renewables into another format and then utilizing industry. So I think it will play a part. But once again, this is not a question for 2024, 2025, 2026. This is a 2035 question rather than sort of an immediate question. Today, immediate question is we need to stop load shedding, right? Yeah. Green hydrogen is not part of that story, but it will be part of the longer story in terms of the aim to almost decarbonize our economy, and then green hydrogen will play a part in certain aspects. How big a part? Depends who you ask, but I think it will have a part.
Have a part.
On that note, Devon, as I mentioned, do you want to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe just from an impact perspective, it's also. I think it's quite important that even when we are exploring various options to add to the mix, because essentially what we need is a mix that is lower on carbon and fossil fuels. And we need to get there, so we can't escape that. But I think even when we're exploring all these options, we also need to then understand the potentially negative impacts of that technology. So my very little understanding of green hydrogen, water is a very important aspect of producing that. And we have a water crisis as well. So when you're now having to consider this, and that's why I think from our perspective as allocators of capital, we need to then make sure that when we're thinking about the impact, we are thinking about all those things, not only thinking about, oh yes, we are producing energy which is less dirty than coal, but understand what is the kind of knock-on effect it has. So I just wanted to put that in perspective, because that is what needs to also happen in this idea of looking at the forest instead of just a few trees. Yeah.
Which is quite interesting, because what you've done here is that you've shifted gears in terms of the conversation slightly, still relevant, but and actually I think Devon's going to have to take this one, and perhaps we can share it with Thabo, because on the one aspect, we have been having a conversation about what's going on in the country, and that's the electricity issues. But I've heard other panelists bring forward that once we deal with this, and perhaps at some point it might come at the same time, is the water issue. How much of a broader then conversation should we be having when we talk then green economy? Because it's not just the power issue. There are other things that are happening, but it's quite nice when you start seeing other executives say, electricity is one thing, but there's something else bubbling under that we also need to pay close attention to. Devon, how are you seeing us bring that to the table so we are as serious about it as we are about the power issue?
Yeah. So again, in the water side, you've got the issue of source and then the transmission of water resources to where the consumption points are happening, right? But you've also got this element of sustainability, the sustainable use of water. And this is probably the biggest implications for us as a water scarce region, where the priority or the attention point is probably more significant right now with respect to the production process and the usage of water, and how that water can be reused, right, and made potable again, and possibly used in other manufacturing processes. So in so much as we're talking about, we know that today we've got some infrastructural challenges with respect to aging infrastructure, lack of investment, and we all experience that today with water shedding as well. And that's a critical problem. And again, the solutions there are multi-pronged again. It's a combination of, again, private sector coming through the party, good structure and governance happening and all of that, right? But I think for me, the water part, we look at it in three aspects. We looked at, initially it was telecommunications, right? Again, fixed line telecommunications being liberalized through, cell phone technology, right? And the same transition is happening right now with centralized electricity, moving to decentralized electricity, moving to rooftop solar, moving to multiple sources of energy. The same thing's going to happen with water, right? Insofar as consumption points are happening. People are going to be a lot more conscious of it. I mean, if you look at the behaviors, for example, in Cape Town, when you go to Cape Town, you don't have a good showers to date because that pressure somehow is restricted on those shower heads, right? And you just wait to come back to Johannesburg to get the full pressure of a good shower. But I can tell you something, the behavior of the Cape Townians have fundamentally changed with respect to day zero and what that meant for them. What's happening with us right now in South Africa, there's an unintended consequence of behavior change brought on by load shedding, right, that the Europeans can't conceive. When I was in France about 8 months ago, on the front pages of Figaro, which is the local newspaper, it was headline news that they're going to have 800 megawatts of load shedding. And then I pulled out Eskom's to push app and I showed one of my colleagues in France and he said, gee whiz, we need this because chaos is going to reign because, they don't have this culture of accepting this reality, whereas we have. And we've tried to find workarounds to it. But more importantly, is this consciousness of the frugality of how we now use energy as much as the Cape Townians understand how to use water. And that's where I think Thabo was talking about the social elements of, people need to understand this at a much more macro level to understand the contributions that each of us can make. And, the simple thing of keeping your cell phone charger plugged in the wall without a cell phone at the end is a sacrilege event that we don't appreciate. That if you've got 10 million people with the cell phone charger plugged into the wall today in an energy crisis, that in itself is, you remove that, you immediately got 1 unit of electricity, energy in a power station freed up, just to make it a bit more dramatic.
Just touch it on that. I'm from Cape Town. Day zero was shocking.
Yeah.
We're looking at going down to the breweries and finding the stream water and people standing in queues for water, from the mountain.
Yeah.
But it takes me back in the beautiful thing of age. And, when you looked at El Nino, in 1994, I came to do VAC work in Johannesburg. And when I left Johannesburg, there was a board. Joburg was big with billboards. There was a board out there and showing Cape Town in 1994 and in 2030, Cape Town, and they had Namibia compared to it. And Cape Town was Namibia and Namibia was Cape Town. Le Chatelet's principle, the state of equilibrium, and it comes again with the just in transition. Water is a resource, but it's a balance. We have in droughts, Natal is having floods. So it's all the climate change. It's a chain reaction. So where there's water, where there's water less, there's water more. So it's all related to climate change. And coming back to from that perspective, something that we're not looking in South Africa is agrivoltaics. Looking at into agrivoltaics where we get in energy, but we look in greenhouse sort of agrivoltaics in also cultivation, food security, hydroponics, where we're conserving, you could farm in the desert. So water, it's balancing water with electricity, and there's not one agrivoltaic park in South Africa. And, we having this climate issues. So again, that just in transition in the sense and how we implement it from a governmental level, needs to be more. I mean, today you can't do a solar plant because you've got to get a subdivision of agricultural land.
Right.
Yeah.
That's okay. Thabo, you've had the gentlemen on either side of you give very interesting perspective, and I'm curious as to, based on what they've just said, how are you seeing it?
I agree. I think those are valuable points. And I think also just to bring it back to green hydrogen, and I'll dovetail with the water issue. We've done about a dozen pilots on green hydrogen, different parts of the world, for different use cases. So be it aviation fuel or, in fact, using green hydrogen to re-electrify. So for instance, we've got a pilot up in Dubai, precisely using solar to power up and then re-electrify Dubai in the evening. And I think for me, it is not a question around water and those factors. I think it's a much deeper issue. So we figured out technologically how we can reduce, how we can minimize, and how do you recycle some of that water. I mean, we do know, obviously, you can put these plants closer to the ocean and then therefore create something that's a lot more manageable. I think for me, at the heart of it is how do we, especially in South Africa, and maybe specifically South Africa, how do we have a conversation that cuts across different departments? Okay. So you have a DMRE that will sit with a specific energy issue, and yet there's an environment and forestry department on the other end, there's a transport that's sitting on the other end. How do we learn and how do we, in an agile manner, be able to integrate these views and collaboratively solve those problems? Because I think that's where the heart of the issue is at. It is less around where it emanates from, it's more around how do we get government departments to be in the same room, agree on the same thing, because green hydrogen, it's not about production, it's about using it somewhere else, be it in mobility, be it in chemical sector, and so forth.
So essentially you're saying, how do we sing from the same hymn, so to speak? Okay. I want to stay with you on this one because I mentioned in the intro that because we're talking about energy security and bridging borders, let's talk then collaboration in terms of private-public sort of collaborations that you're seeing, whether it's across the board, across regions, et cetera, given the work that Siemens Southern Africa has done on the ground. Are we seeing that more? What more do we need to be doing in order to see those collaborations happening between South Africa and Namibia, or South Africa and other sort of neighboring countries?
I think to sum up your question, my counter question is, are we doing enough?
Okay.
Because that collaboration exists, and I think with classic cases, the energy crisis, you could see Mozambique stepping up. It's not that they're stepping up now, they've always stepped up. We've just not been as receptive. Recently in Namibia as well, Angola, I mean, I use this example, Angola has got 2 gigawatts of renewable power from hydro, idle. We can't get it to the grid or the South African power pool. So there's a connection that they can do that goes through DRC that can link up into the power pool, and that could help 2 stages of load shedding. So I think there's the question of, are we doing enough? Of course, other neighboring countries are able to support and so on. And I think that's a wider conversation I would put in. But then also we've seen internally in private sector as well, there's a lot of offering that had happened, either various pledges and so on, to try and alleviate some of the issues. I think for us it's a question of how do we become good at implementation? How do we become faster in implementation? We're very good to sit and share and collaborate, but I think we need to move beyond that to some progress on the ground.
How would you rate us, Stuart, on implementation? Where are we now?
When did load shedding start?
It's been a while.
But I think the key goes to what the role of a government playing in your question of implementation is, how can government provide an enabling environment for the private sector to do what it does best, which is implement? And I think it was because this just transition is such a politically sensitive topic, there was a lot of barriers in terms of private sector almost stepping in and trying to play its part. The private sector in the renewables place maybe play its part in the reprocess, but that's still a government-led program. And I think 2 years ago, the legislation changed and allowed effectively private players to build power at scale. And I think now you're almost starting to see the beginning of the private sector implement. And I think that's going to be the solution in terms of how load shedding gets fixed, is the private sector implementing. Because I think in South Africa, private sector generally has lots of problems and lots of faults, but it implements well. And I think that's you now seeing the government almost step back and saying, here's the legislative framework, we're going to try and get out of the way in a way and let you implement. And I think that's the key to solving a lot of these problems, is letting the private sector step forward and build power plants and contract with other private sector players. So you don't need government to be providing the capital. Private sector can be providing the capital and do what they do best.
I want to throw a spanner in the works here, and this is a question I've been thinking about, especially as the conversation around skills comes into play here, and how we perhaps need to sort of evolve and adapt to the way things are changing. And the reason I want to ask this is that oftentimes when we talk about Eskom, and we talk about splitting Eskom into three, or changing the way we do logistics, or having some aspects of Transnet having a bit of a private sector exposure, we tend to have pushback from the unions because there's this fear of jobs and fear of various other things. Do we then need to have a different conversation in which we have the unions trying to see the way we are looking at, say, climate change or the transition? Because I feel like when we have this conversation, it's always here sitting as corporates, and if we do have somebody who is a policymaker, it's not very often, but there is a group or consortium that have exposure to the people on the ground who actually, when we talk of skills, we need to include them in that conversation. Is that missing, or is it there, but we're not having it at a louder conversation when we bring in unions and workers to the way we're seeing green economy? I don't know who wants to take that one. Let's hear from you.
I can give you a view from a financial institution perspective. So you've seen a lot of growth in the discipline of sustainable finance, and particularly you saw it start off with responsible investment as a way to basically then say you need to invest in such a way that you're taking into account environmental, social, and governance risks and opportunities, right? And for instance, what has an interesting project that was started quite a while ago. It was when I was with the PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, back in 2013. It was a partnership that was with BATSETA, which is a retirement fund council of South Africa, and then they also had the Norwegian government funding it in such a way that you can then help various stakeholders in the retirement fund space to then put their heads together about how do we mobilize finance to make sure that we can then achieve sustainable outcomes. And in that, stakeholders, including unions, were there because they're also quite influential in terms of, talks around employee benefits. So for us, it's a very, very big thing. So in terms of the conversations started long ago. I think they can be a bit more elevated because, to your point, I think maybe not everyone is sitting around the table at the same time, and that's what we need. But from a financial services perspective, those conversations started way back in the 1980s already, when even Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act was promulgated, because it was like we need to have investments that are socially desirable, and how do we then make sure we partner with the likes of the organization I'm with now and others to make sure that we, at least the finance is there.
Thabo?
So the supply of skills largely depends on the demand that is out there.
Okay.
And I think that perhaps needs to be the starting point in these conversations with labor movements and so on. Because, in fact, earlier panel, you had the energy water seat on, they've done a beautiful research around some of the green skills that they see out there and that are there. I think that needs to be tabled and shown clearly how it could add up. But the other element that I've noticed, we see it in our organization, is a lot of these assets span various decades, right? And I don't think we sit and talk about the longer term around. I mean, if you put up a solar park or a wind park, that's 20, 25 years of operation. Where are the skills that are going to maintain all those things? And I think those are some of the proof points that could be used on as part of that conversation. Then the second leg that's more important is that a lot of what we are seeing and a lot of skill sets that are going to be required are a lot more digital.
Yeah.
And that conversation doesn't feature as prominently as it should be, and that change is coming fast. We see it in our sector. I mean, we've opened up a power academy, and we train on anything between 400 to over 500 people just on digitalization of power plants and so on, and the control systems behind it. So that's a strong conversation and proof point as well that you can put on the table. However, I do have to say this, that I think while jobs could be the centrality of, and the important conversation, there has to be a parallel conversation that happens at a younger age. There are a lot of STEM-related skill sets that are required. We're just not having that conversation, even at schooling level, to talk about various career choices, so we prepare them for the future that's coming. And I don't think that's happening, especially the awareness is not brought on as quickly as possible, because that's where we need to be able to work from, instead of just focusing at a job-only level.
We've got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to pause it and we'll continue the conversation. But I just want to take stock in terms of the audience, whether we've got any questions so far. So if we do, we'll incorporate it into this conversation that we're having. So just checking from the audience, do we have any questions? And if so, if you could raise your hand and then we'll get a microphone to you. I see a hand over there and the gentleman in the front. Yes, please, you can stand up. And please let us know who you're directing your question to.
Well, the question is directed to anyone. They can choose who wants to go first.
We'll pick the victim.
All right. My name is Siabonga Chukwana. I'm from Green Energy Services. Let me follow up, in your statement. One, when you said, can anyone or everyone sing in the same hymn book? And we read the same sermon. Let me also pick up from Tabo's point. Where can we have a conversation that cuts across everybody in an agile manner? And the point he just made now, around the digital skill set and the skills that you also mentioned. My understanding is that when there is a crisis, everybody shouts. And it depends on who shouts out loud, who will be listened. Everybody right now, we've got a crisis with ESCOM. And everybody is looking at alternatives, whether there's hydrogen, whether there is solar and everything. Stuart, you spoke about this, that there are some programs that when you plan, you've got to say, do we want to address this in the next 15 or 25 years? Hydro, in terms of supporting the current crisis. If you walk around each and every household, as you said, I just forgot, the gentleman from Sanlam. This is a social program. It has to be addressed in that particular manner. If you walk around the households, whether it's urban, whether it's in rural areas, one common thing that you will find in those households is gas. And gas falls within that. I think, Thabo, you did mention that point. Shouldn't the conversation right now say, in the next 5 years, the focus should be on using gas to address this crisis, because gas is not expensive. Gas is easily accessible, and all households, they use gas. Over the years, as we move, and we try to scale people because we have very few qualified gas practitioners in the country. We skill them from a digital, training that Thabo is talking about.
Yeah.
Shouldn't the focus be beyond that?
Okay.
Over the years, we move into all the other things.
All right, awesome. So let's see, who can be the victim to take that one, Devin? And while you answer that, we'll get a mic quickly to the gentleman in the front.
I think, the gentleman before me talked about it. I think the point is that there has to be a number of multiple steps. The priorities, for example, that the modern economies have, or the more advanced economies have, with respect to their own climate change agenda, cannot be the same for us as an emerging market with different challenges, with different circumstances. So, everyone talked about the fact that there has to be a phased approach to, as we get to a net zero environment, where we're not producing any carbon in the form of generation of energy, right? And that's a pipe dream, really, from our current reality. It is a pipe dream, whether we like to believe it or not, considering the fact that we've got a base load, issue in the country right now that is required so desperately to, pump up and prime this economy for the creation of jobs, which we know, which is another looming crisis. In fact, not a looming crisis, it is a crisis, right? It's happening right now. And all the social ills that we're dealing with in terms of youth unemployment, which is sitting at 50% today, right? And so we cannot wax lyrical about, on one hand, pandering to the let's say the West or the more advanced economies in terms of where they are in their economic stages and their social stages and the political stages to us. So your gas proposal, absolutely fine. I mean, today there has to be, and I think somebody talked about it as well, this public-private partnership. How does it have to work? Everybody needs to understand what significance in terms of the roles that they can contribute, what government role is in terms of enabling, what private sector capability is. And I think the free market economy needs to be allowed to flourish, because when we see that time and time again, it's willing buyer, willing seller, right? Ultimately, that has to happen. Government does have to play a role, because to your point, when you talked about the fact that there's a threat, constant threat of displacement of jobs, that cannot be avoided when you're talking about public-private partnerships. This is where, and we've seen this, private sector has responded many times to this. The fact that there's an access requirement to do business in a specific country, whether it's local content, whether it's black economic empowerment, whether it's a mining charter, whether it's NIP. Private sector have not left the country, they're all here, right? Because there is still opportunity to manage both these elements. So I think that, the point is valid. We can absolutely have all of these things playing out together and ultimately manage the transition to this ideal state, which we're not ready for right now.
Thabo, can I get the question from the gentleman here just quickly before we wrap up? We've got about a couple of minutes left.
No, thanks very much. My name is Landio Matlanga. I'm actually in the impact investment space. What I wanted just to ask the panel, and I'm sure they may have actually confronted that question in different ways, the issue of energy poverty. I know, in this country, we have somehow, mitigated that through free basic electricity, but really in our neighbors, it's actually a reality. How do we answer that question? How do we address that question in the context of energy transition? I've seen that attitude even prevalent in some of the business people who actually said, but how do you expect us to decarbonize when we have hardly carbonized? If you could answer that question.
Stuart, do you want to take that one?
Sure. In a South African context, I think the extent of the grid is, I think we're 80 or almost 90% connected. So 90% of households are connected to the electricity grid. So there it's a question of how do you put enough power into the grid? There already isn't a mechanism to effectively distribute the power. I think outside of a South African context, you go up to places like the DRC, there's 10, 15% electrification, right? 85% of the population doesn't have access to sort of centrally connected electricity. I think the green transition is the solution, in that you can't go build a coal-powered power plant every village, right? The economics don't work. You can build a battery solar mini grid. They can do it. It's a distributed solution. You can do it on scale, but in micro different instances. And that isn't power that's going to allow for industrialization of those areas, because it is still sort of small amounts of power, but it will make a dramatic impact on energy poverty in terms of there now is electricity available in a village in the DRC or in towns in the DRC, for places with a million people town with no electrification. So I think, and as the cost of solar panels go down, the cost of batteries go down, your ability to do even smaller installations in even more remote places to help address energy poverty becomes more and more possible with the green transition. So I think in the South African context, it's a bit different there. It's about just finding electrons, whatever shape or format. In the wider African context, the green transition really is a very possible solution that is happening at scale right now. These mini grids are getting rolled out by the private sector very quickly.
All right, on that note, unfortunately, we have run out of time, and there were so many questions that I'm sure we would have loved to unpack. And with that said, we'd like to say goodbye to the online audience who have been watching. And as I mentioned to those of you who are in the audience, the live audience, that is that our panelists will be available if there are questions that you want to ask and engage with them further. So thank you so much to Stuart, AJ, Thabo, Devin, and of course, Golisa. And thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, goodbye.